folks. Welcome to week 4. So, this week we are looking at research and we're looking at technical descriptions. So, in terms of research, we are looking at how to vet resources, how to focus your research question, some research terminology, and then human research. And then within technical descriptions, we are focusing on object descriptions. I'll talk a little bit about process descriptions, and then there are also concept descriptions, but that's not part of what we're focusing on. So make sure that you read chapter 4 on research and you read section 7.4, which will give you information on technical descriptions. And that is where you will find the assignment that is associated with what you're required to do this week. You will actually be doing an assignment that is found there in the textbook. Okay, all right. So, in terms of research terminology, we'll just talk about a few things here. So, first of all, you have the concept of primary, secondary, and tertiary resources. So, primary resources, as I'm sure you have already learned, are resources that are first-hand resources. So when you have eyewitness accounts, when you have somebody who is directly there when research was done to observe the data or to observe the results and gather that data, then those are primary resources. Secondary resources might analyze and discuss data gathered by others. And then tertiary resources are going to be things like maybe encyclopedias, or dictionaries, maybe even handbooks that are going to refer in a general way and sometimes even summarize information about a particular topic. Okay, so I'm sure you already have experience in vetting resources. So, one of the things that you always need to do is ask yourself, is the resource that I'm using reliable? And so there are a number of ways to determine this. You need to look at who the authors are, right? You need to look at their history in the field. You need to look at their credentials, right? Does this person actually have a job in this field? Does this person have a doctorate in this field? And then what is their history of publishing on this particular subject? So not only do they work with the concepts or the materials discussed here, but have they been publishing for a long time? Do they have a wide reader base? If there are any reviews of their work or of their publications, are you able to see those reviews and get an idea of how well versed they are based on those reviews? You always want to make sure that you are using the most reliable sources that you can. Okay, so when we're talking about focusing your research question, the issue here is that if you don't focus your research question enough, then you might wind up in a situation where you're sort of spiraling out of control, getting way more information than you need, and then you've got stacks and stacks and stacks of data that goes way beyond what you actually need to answer your research question. And so what you need to do is first determine exactly what it is that you need to know, and then you want to use qualifiers, right, in your question, right, to make it as precise and exact as possible so that you wind up only gathering the information that you very specifically need, right? And you don't have any extra information that's extraneous and unnecessary to the question that you're trying to answer. And this will save you a lot of time when you are actually writing, when you're actually applying that information, right? And so you don't have to sift through a lot of unnecessary information, extraneous information. You will have just what you need, right? And maybe a little bit more. Okay. All right, so finally, we can talk a little bit about human research. So, your human research might take place in the form of interviews, it might take place in the form of surveys. And of course, these are not the only types of human research. So, there might be other types of human research where you need them to interact with some kind of material in one way, or you need them to act out a process, right? Now, the big thing here, and I'm sure you have encountered this question as students before, is what am I allowed to do without authorization, and what am I allowed to do that requires authorization? And so this is a question that you always need to ask, especially if there is some kind of thing that students need to sign a waiver for, right? That's probably a sign that you need to get authorization in order to perform that particular experiment. So within the university, right? You already have your resources there, but outside the university, you always want to make sure that it's appropriate to do a certain experiment and see if you can get the authorization that you might need. Okay. All right. So in terms of technical descriptions, as I said, you have object descriptions, you have process descriptions, and you have concept descriptions. We are mainly focusing on object descriptions, though I'll talk a little bit about process descriptions. Okay, so an object description, that is what you'll be focusing on in the assignment that you're doing, and you have all of your instructions for how to put together an object description. So the things that you'll be thinking about are, what does the object look like? So you'll want to provide visuals for that. You will also be thinking about, how can I give a definition of the object, right? And what its purpose is, right? And then you will also be talking about its components, how those components work together, and even things like the measurements of the object, right? All technical information that the person who might be interested in receiving that in one form or another would need to know, right? So places where you might see a technical description of an object, right, might include user manuals, right, or some other kind of online documentation, right, or it might be in a sales presentation, right, because technical descriptions of objects are pertinent to sales, right? You need your audience, whether it's an individual, whether it's a company, to understand exactly what it is that they are purchasing, right, and what the purpose of that is, what it's going to look like, what its components are, etc. In the assignment that you are doing, you will have the opportunity to determine the object that you are writing a technical description of on your own, and I hope you're able to have a little bit of fun with that. Okay, so I want to talk just a little bit about process descriptions, because in this class you will, in the next module, be writing instructions, and there may be a little bit of overlap, right, between instructions and process descriptions, but they're not exactly the same thing. So with a process description, you are giving people information about a process, right? It's going to include more background information. You'll be talking about how a process is or was done, right? And how it works, and giving your audience as much background information as they need to understand that, right? Whereas with a set of instructions, you are simply giving your audience a set of numbered instructions, right? The commands, essentially, in second person, that take them from the beginning of that process to the end of that process, and help make sure that they are able to achieve whatever that goal is in a safe manner, in a way that they're able to understand everything very clearly. Now, the amount of information that you do need to provide when you're giving instructions will vary. Sometimes your audience will need a little bit more context, a little bit more background information, but not to the same degree as when you are doing a process description. Okay. All right, so a few things that I want to talk about with your technical descriptions. So you really want to focus on clarity, right? So if you want somebody to understand how to use something, or if you want somebody to purchase something, it's really incumbent upon you to make sure that you are giving them the information about that thing in the most understandable manner that you can, right? You don't want them to be making any mistakes with it. You don't want them to misunderstand what it is or what it's for. You don't want them to even misunderstand what the sizes or the components are, right? And one of the number one ways to make sure that you get this accurate is to make sure that your information is always audience oriented. Okay, so who is the audience that you are pitching your description to, right? What are their demographics, right? What is it that what is their level of understanding of the topic at hand, right? So you might have an expert audience, right? In which case you can use a lot of technical jargon with them. Or you might have a layperson audience in which they don't maybe understand anything about that, or you might assume that they don't understand anything about what it is that you're going to describe. And then you're going to need to use simpler language and maybe go into a little bit more detail. Okay. And then finally, you are going to want to determine how many visuals you need to provide in order to help make sure that your audience has a clear understanding of what it is that you're trying to describe, what the components are, how the components interact with each other, and where they are. Okay. And finally, just another note on research terminology. So you will be getting different types of data, both quantitative and qualitative. So when we're talking about quantitative data, we're talking about data that you can measure. So in terms of your technical descriptions, right, this is talking about numbers, essentially, like how large is something? How can you describe that in units? How much does it weigh? Etc. Now, when we're talking about qualitative descriptions or qualitative data, qualitative data is referring to something that you're going to write out in words instead. So, people's opinions, people's feelings, people's beliefs, even reviews that people give on a certain product, right? This is qualitative data. And there are quantitative ways to measure qualitative data, right? But essentially, it starts as qualitative, right? It starts as feelings, it starts as beliefs, it's etc. And then maybe you can say, well, how often do we see this word come up in multiple different reviews or multiple different paragraph responses, etc. And in that way, it can become numerical, but it starts out as qualitative. All right, so if you have any questions or you have any issues getting the assignment done, please give me a shout at my email or on Teams, preferably Teams, and I will do what I can to try and help out. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week.